All right, so here we are back at it again. Respiratory physiology. So we finished embryology and anatomy. They're relatively small sections, but there was a lot to talk about, right? We talked about all the different parts of the lungs, what they're all called, bronchopulmonary segments and stuff, where a seed or a peanut would go in terms of left or right lung anatomy, whether it be the upper lobe or the lower lobe, etc. We also talked about doing thoracentesis to get pleural fluid and where the correct place would be to insert the needle. So that was another big discussion. And now we're looking at stuff that gets much more complex. So a lot of this is stuff that, in my opinion, without any obvious bias towards myself, I don't really think people teach it very well. For example, in cardiology, a lot of people have struggle understanding what would amplify the heart sound of a person with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. That's like a very basic question regarding the physiology of the heart, a little bit of pathology of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, and then understanding the physiology of cardiac maneuvers, which either amplify or weaken heart sounds, right? And a lot of students have to either memorize it or just guess. But to understand and truly just know what would amplify the heart sounds in a person who has hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, what maneuver would amplify it, all you have to think of is the fact that in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, your heart is all muscle. So the ventricles are super tiny, right? Super, super tiny ventricles, and then they're supposed to have blood in there, right? Now, if you did something to lower the amount of blood in there, then it would just literally be pure muscle clumping into each other every time it beats, right? So you want to do something that's going to lower the amount of blood in this person's heart to amplify the heart sounds in someone who has hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. And one such maneuver would be sudden standing. In fact, someone who has hypertrophic obstructive cardiomyopathy inherited from their father or mother, usually those people have sudden cardiac death, often because of some sport they might have taken a part in, but they can actually die without playing any sports just because they got out of bed too quickly. So that sudden standing can actually lead to death in hypertrophic HOCM, hypertrophic obstructive cardiomyopathy. But that's some kind of maneuver stuff that you really needed to like visualize and understand, right? People often struggle with what maneuvers would cause what kind of murmur to get louder or weaker. Now here in respiratory physiology, there's a similar thing. There's a very big deal regarding, of course, sounds for sure with consolidation and whether you're going to do tactile fremitus and whatnot, pectoralique and all of that stuff. Those are other things. But there's a whole phenomenon of what happens with alveolar vessels and how pressure and volume changes as you're breathing, right? So as you start from the basic zero, then you inhale, and then you expire air. That entire time, within microseconds, a lot of things are happening, right? And it's often difficult to understand questions because you're thinking of a larger time frame, but everything's happening within a second, right? One breath, inspiration, expiration, one breath just takes a second on average. And in that 1 second, in half a second, a lot of things happened, and in another half a second, when you were expiring, different things happened, and there's different pressures all over. You can be presented with all kinds of graphs, right? All kinds of graphs, just like we had all kinds of graphs put together in the cardiovascular page where they have everything in one group, ECG, JVP, all of that in the same graph. Some same kind of stuff here too, because there really is a lot to know in terms of different pressures in different parts of the lung, right? And it's very important to understand how this thing works. So before we even reach there, there's going to be a pretty big topic to talk about right here using the volumes. And before we get into anything too complex, let's really understand lung volumes, right? There's nothing to memorize here. You don't really need to per se have like full, mastered knowledge of this. You should just know what these are based off the names. The names of the volumes actually tell you what these are. And then if ever given a graph like this, right, where the stuff isn't labeled, you should be able to reproduce this. So before you're actually ready for step one, you should be able to reproduce this entire thing, both the liter lung volumes and then the lung capacities. And these things are not things you need to memorize. The names of these volumes and capacities actually tell you what they are. So let's take a look at them. First one, inspiratory reserve volume, right? So inspiratory reserve volume is the air that can still be breathed in after normal inspiration. And this is from the name. You're inspiring more than you're respiring the reserve volume, right? And you can see your inspiratory reserve volume right here. This big portion up here is inspiring more than you normally need to, right? Your tidal volume, which I honestly think should be the first thing they put up here, but they put it in LITER orders, so I get it. But the first thing you need to understand is your tidal volume, TV, air that moves into lung with each quiet inspiration, and is typically 500 milliliters, right? And that's your tidal volume, the amount of air that comes in every time you do a normal inspiration, expiration, normal inspiration, normal expiration. That's it, right? So that's your tidal volume. Now, inspiratory reserve is inspiring more, which is this reserve space. This is space reserved for extra air in case you need to take a super deep breath. Maybe because you're about to enter a really smelly room. Maybe you're about to dive into water. Whatever it might be, this is reserve space that you don't normally use. On average, when you're breathing on a normal day while watching this video or while doing whatever that isn't extraneous, while you're relaxing, you're just using this much, right? Then you have inspiratory reserve volume for very athletic or very difficult tasks. Then there's an expiratory reserve volume, same thing. You have some reserve space where you have a little bit of air that you don't normally breathe out. You can breathe that out too. Maybe you needed to do a full breathing out as much air as possible for whatever reason. That's the expiratory reserve volume, air that can still be breathed out after normal expiration. So these first three are super easy to understand and they go together. You have your tidal volume, which is normal breathing. Then you have inspiratory reserve, breathing in more, filling up your empty inspiratory reserve. Expiratory reserve, breathing out more, right? And that's it. Then you have residual volume. That's the last thing for the liter stuff, LITER. The residual volume is air that's always in your lungs. You just cannot breathe it out. Air in the lung after maximal expiration. Residual volume and any lung capacity that includes residual volume cannot be measured by spirometry because spirometry actually requires you to move that air and residual volume does not move. All right, now what are other capacities that also have residual volume? Well, FRC has residual volume in it and TLC has residual volume in it. Right, so if you ever have a question where they're telling you that you measured it with spirometry and then you have a bunch of answer choices asking you what must have been measured, well, they definitely did not measure FRC, TLC, or residual volume. Right, so you're going to pick another answer choice. And that's really important to remember. You can't measure something you can't really breathe out. That's the concept. Because of the function by nature, the way a spirometer works, you cannot measure residual volume. So you cannot measure anything that requires residual volume either. Right? Then you have your capacities, which are also very well named. Inspiratory capacity. How much can you fucking breathe in? That's it. Right? That's literally all it is. How much air can you breathe in? So that's your tidal volume plus the extra you can breathe in. Right? And you have your vital capacity, which is vital means for life, right? How much can you use for living purposes? That goes in to tie in your expiratory reserve volume also. All right, so your vital capacity will be everything on this graph from 1.2 to all the way to 6.0, right? So that's 4.8, right? 4.8. 4 plus 1 is 5.8 plus 2. Yeah. Right, so that's going to be everything between this area right here. So basically, vital capacity does not count residual volume because residual volume is not something you use for vitality. You don't use residual volume for surviving. It's just air that's inside your lung and it can't come out because it's in some area where you don't actually move air. Right, that's really all you want to think of over there. Then you have functional residual capacity. Right, residual capacity. This one is the only one where the wording itself doesn't really encompass what it truly might be. But just remember that the up stuff here, the inspiratory residual stuff, was already captured in inspiratory capacity. Right, so functional residual capacity must be the expiratory stuff, and that's exactly what it is. It's your expiratory capacity plus the amount of air that you just cannot expire, but it's there. It's residual. It sits there. Right, that's your functional residual capacity right there. Then total lung capacity, of course, is obvious. That's everything. That's everything from 0 to 6.0, the whole thing. All right. So very important to make sure that you can understand these lung volumes and reproduce this entire liter graph and lung capacity without having to look at the book. By the time you can do that, you are ready for step 1. And if you can't yet do it, then you're not yet ready for step 1. Now, here is a question using that stuff, using the volumes and stuff in the question stem. But this question teaches a lot of physiology, and it utilizes this graph that you might have seen before if you were doing UWorld questions, and you might not have actually understood. So I'm going to try to break the graph down the best I can, really get you to see what's happening, right? Because it's very important. Being a math major really helped. There really was I've never seen a video anywhere where either Kaplan, USMLE RX, anyone truly broke the graph down for me and helped me understand what happened there. It just took me my own time to figure it out. Look at it, look at the numbers, throw in numbers into it, and then figure out what's happening. So let's take a look at what's here. You have a question from UWorld. At which point of the following lung volumes would total pulmonary vascular resistance be the lowest? Right, so resistance. This is a question about some level of pressure. And they're asking you where pulmonary resistance, so pulmonary blood pressure in a sense. At what point would pulmonary blood pressure be the lowest, right? And then they give you this graph, and imagine different parts of the graph are labeled, so maybe A, B, C, D, E, stuff like that, okay? How do you do this, right? So you would have 5 answer choices. It would be A, B, C, D, and E. Where is pulmonary vascular resistance going to be the lowest? Now, from residual volume all the way to TLC, that's basically going from 0 air in your lungs to completely breathing in a shit ton of air, as much air as possible, right? All the way up to your inspiratory reserve volume, going into maximum inspiratory capacity, right? Where would pulmonary pressure be lowest? So how do you understand that? Well, in this graph, they're showing you something, right? You have your total. Well, let's look at the axes first, right? The axis, this axis down here, the x-axis is your lung volume. The y-axis is pressure, pulmonary pressure. And you can see how, for some weird reason that you may or may not know, for some weird reason, pressure first decreases up to FRC, then increases after that, right? So for this question, the answer was that it would be at the 2.2 liter volume, right? 2.2 liter volume, which is about your right here, where you're about to start breathing in air, and that's basically your the tidal volume area, right? So let's take a look at the explanation, and then I'm going to break down this graph. So the answer was at the 2.2 liter volume of normal expiration. The image to the right is given in the explanation. The highly compliant nature of the pulmonary circulation means that the degree of lung distension has a large effect on pulmonary vascular resistance. Increased lung volumes, which are from FRC to TLC, right, from here to here when you're breathing in, cause alveolar expansion and lengthwise stretching of the interstitial alveolar blood vessels. This increases their length and reduces their diameter, thus increasing alveolar vessel resistance. And that's what they're showing up here. Okay, so you can see how the big gray circle is your alveoli, right? And then these, the red pipes around the alveoli are your blood vessels. So what's happening here? Well, clearly you're breathing air in, so you're definitely going to fill up your alveoli with air, and the blood vessels are going to get very thin. Why are they going to get thin? By getting thin, they're able to pick up air. They're able to do the gas exchange, and not only that, remember from cardiovascular, we said that hypertension, when you squeeze blood vessels and make it thin, it means that blood leaves that vessel and goes to an organ now. Right, that's always something you want to remember, and this was something we've always spoken about every time we did cardiovascular. I said that if you're holding a water hose or any kind of pipe that has water running through it, and you squeeze the hose, water starts running quicker, right? Water leaves the hose, and that makes sense. Of course, if you have vasodilation and the blood vessel gets really, really thick, then blood is going to stay in the vessel, right? But here in your lung, if you're breathing air in, you don't want blood to stay in the alveoli. Right, so this blood is going to grab air and leave the alveoli and go to other organs, right? So this is half of the image right here. You want to make sure you get it, right? Breathing air in increases total pressure, right? And you can see how the alveolar blood vessel is now constricted. So alveolar blood pressure right? The capillaries over here around the alveoli, the pulmonary vascular resistance, that blood pressure is going to increase, right? Because you're going to have to constrict to send blood away from the alveoli and send it to muscles where you need the oxygen that you just picked up, right? So that's breathing. Now, number two, decreased lung volumes, which is pretty much expiration from FRC to pretty much just expiratory reserve volume. You can't really expire the residual volume stuff. But this left half, which I've labeled as 2, this left half is basically the expiration stuff, right? Air volume is decreasing. Decreased lung volumes during expiration cause the extra-alveolar arteries and veins to become narrow due to the decreased radial traction from adjacent tissues and compression by the positive intrathoracic pressure. This leads to an increase in extra-alveolar vessel resistance. Right, so now you can see how the alveoli have become smaller, right? And remember, you're causing, this leads to an increase in extra-alveolar vessel resistance, but not the alveolar, right? Increasing alveolar vessel resistance was in number 1, where you were breathing in, right? Alveolar vessel resistance increased, so the pipe became skinnier. When you're breathing air out, the alveolar vessels are really big now. Why? Because now blood is sitting there by the alveoli, waiting for new air to come in, right? But at this moment, you've been expiring. And why does blood need to be here if you're expiring? Because you need to expire all the CO2 they brought back, right? You need to breathe out all the CO2 they just brought back. But of course, extra-alveolar things have compressed, right? This is skinnier now, whereas over here, this was bigger. So all I personally do is I just try to remember what's going to happen to the alveolar blood vessel, and then the extra-alveolar vessels are going to be the opposite way. So when you're breathing out, alveolar capillaries become really, really fat. All the blood sits around your alveoli, and it sends CO2 into the alveoli so you can breathe it out. That's basically how you want to think about it. When you're breathing in, right, all the blood that was in your vessels now leaves the alveolar vessels and goes to muscles, right? So you have vasoconstriction here because they already got the air they needed, right? They have to become thin anyway. The blood vessel has to become thin for gas exchange. Then they pick up the air they need into the hemoglobin and leave the alveoli. They're not going to sit by the alveoli anymore. If you want to sit by the alveoli, you need your alveolar capillaries to stay fat. That would give you space. But you can see how the alveolar capillaries become very thin when you're breathing in, right? Because you don't want to sit by the alveoli with air, right? You take your air and you leave. Pulmonary vascular resistance is calculated as a sum of the alveolar and extra-alveolar resistances as these vessels lie in series with each other, right? So remember, resistance, calculating resistance of things that are in series, you just add them. Whereas things that are parallel, those resistances, you have to add the reversed fraction of it, right? The reciprocal of it. So you don't do that here. Here, these vessels are all lying in series, so you just add the resistances together. So those are the two resistances they're talking about, right? You have your extra-alveolar vessel, where the resistance is decreasing as you breathe in, and then you have your alveolar vessel, where the resistance is increasing as you breathe in. And because this total pressure is a sum of alveolar and extra-alveolar pressures, that's why it's actually got this U shape to it, like a parabola, right? On your graphing calculator, you would graph this as something like y equals x squared, and you would get a parabola. And the reason it has this parabolic shape of a U is because it's a sum of these two things. So what's up with these two things? Well, we already figured out the alveolar vessel, right? We just spoke about the alveolar vessel, that as you breathe air in, your alveolar vessel becomes skinnier, right? It was fat in the beginning, and then it becomes skinnier. Why? Because you're breathing in air, you're putting it into the blood, and now that blood needs to be sent to muscles. So you become a skinnier vessel here to squeeze the blood away from the alveoli. And then extra-alveolar vessels have to become fatter because that's where the blood is going, right? Remember, alveolar vessel became skinny so it could send the blood away. Extra-alveolar vessels, think of that as like vessels in your muscle. Those veins are going to become fat so you can get all the oxygen into there, right? And taking that sum, adding this point and this point, this point and this point, and the 0, 0, and then adding all of these points here gives you this U shape. Right, now you're going to see this U shape over and over. It's going to keep showing up. You see it again here, right? You can also see as you keep going, where's the other graph? This one right here. Same thing again, right? The intrapleural pressure gives you this U shape. It's a sum, right? And same thing happens with this also, by the way, right? When you're breathing in, you can see how this vessel is going in like a sine curve kind of thing, right? So we're going to look at those graphs, each one by one, because you do get questions about it. But all in all, just make sure you remember that this is a question about pulmonary vascular resistance. And pulmonary vascular resistance is a sum of alveolar vessel pressure plus extraalveolar vessel pressure. And as you breathe in, alveolar vessel pressure increases, extraalveolar vessel pressure decreases, right? And from FRC forward, the total increases. Right? So you definitely want to make sure you remember this half of breathing in, right? Because oftentimes, most questions, you're really just going to get this much of the graph in it, not the whole thing. Right? So if you do see a question, you're more than likely about to see a question where it's something like this. Right? So this is going to be your x-axis from FRC to TLC, and then your y-axis is going to be your pulmonary vascular resistance, and they're just going to ask you like, oh, why is this going up like that? Well, the reason it's going up because it's a sum of alveolar vessel and extraalveolar vessel pressures, and as you're breathing in, alveolar vessel pressure or pulmonary vascular resistance, both of those things, same thing, increases. All right. So that's something you want to make sure you get. Spend a little time on it. Make sure you understand how you transition from here to here. Right? I'm adding air into the alveoli. My alveoli is going to get full of air. And if air is in the alveoli, the vessels around it, the alveolar vessels, have to constrict to send the air away from the alveoli into muscle. That's basically it. Right, so then they went on to tell you that because alveolar and extraalveolar resistance are increased at high and low lung volumes, both here and here, you can see that it's high. Right, so at high or low lung volumes, the PVR, pulmonary vascular resistance, is super high on both sides, and that's how you get the U shape, right? So because alveolar and extraalveolar resistances are increased at high and low lung volumes, respectively, the total PVR takes the shape of a U curve. Right? So why does it take a U curve? Because when you have no air, when you have zero air in your lung, what's going to be super high? Extraalveolar, right? This one. And when you have 100% air in your lungs, what's going to be high? The alveolar, right? So because at either point, one of the two guys is super high, the sum is high, right? This is the sum up here and another sum down there. So that's what they're explaining. That's really all they're trying to get at. Make sure you understand that. And then for this question, PVR, pulmonary vascular resistance, is lowest at FRC and increases with increasing lung volumes. Okay, and if your answer choices are just numbers, you go with 2.2, right, or something around that. These numbers are given here. Those numbers aren't just examples or something. Those are real numbers based off of the average size of a healthy lung. So you have to know that too. Right, so that's a lot of stuff right there. Make sure you can truly get that. You don't want to forget it. You're often going to get questions very similar to this UWL question right here. You don't want to fuck that up, right? And it's a very simple concept because some of the stuff we're about to look at after this is relatively harder. This concept is not that hard at all. It's just that it needs to be taught correctly, and it's not something that's spoken about a lot. The other half of this page introduces equations, just like we had in cardiovascular, a bunch of equations on how shit works, right? So you have the determination of physiologic dead space and then calculations for ventilation. Determination of physiologic dead space is not that bad, right? So you have the taco, paco, pico, paco. That's actually a very successful mnemonic to remember everything. So the taco is just for VT. That's your tidal volume, right? Tidal volume times PaCO2 minus PeCO2 divided by PaCO2. This is just a ratio. This is just a ratio. So what is this? What are you calculating here? So dead space is a physiologic dead space, right? And physiologic dead space is equal to anatomic dead space plus alveolar dead space, both. Right? Anatomic dead space plus alveolar dead space. What is that? Anatomic dead space is space where you were never supposed to have any alveoli to begin with. It was just a part of your lung that has no alveoli, naturally, or because you lost a portion of that area. And then alveolar dead space is any alveoli where you don't have blood vessels coming to pick up blood because you don't have perfusion there, or any alveoli that doesn't function anymore, so you can't actually do gas exchange. right? That's alveolar dead space. The apex of a healthy lung, the apex, the top portion up here, is the largest contributor of alveolar dead space. Why? Because you have a lot of alveoli at the apex of your lungs too, but blood naturally, because of gravity, goes to the bottom of your lungs, not the top. Right? So there's a lot of air up here that does not participate in gas exchange. Anything that doesn't participate in gas exchange is dead space. Right? Volume of inspired air that does not partake in gas exchange is dead space. Very important to make sure you remember that, because you can get weird experimental questions where some shit is happening and then they're like, how much of that is dead space? Well, as much of that doesn't have any gas exchange in it, all of that is dead space. All right. Physiologic dead space is approximately equivalent to anatomic dead space in a normal lung. It may be greater than the anatomic dead space in lung diseases where you have ventilation perfusion defects. Another topic that intimidates many students, especially when you're new to respiratory, but it should not be so intimidating at all. So basically, ventilation perfusion defects are any defect where you either don't have good ventilation, so you're not breathing correctly or unable to breathe well, or you don't have enough perfusion, maybe because you have actual vascular damage around the lungs or damage to the alveoli themselves. And we're going to see a bunch of diseases, a bunch of conditions where you can actually mess up those vessels, like if you have a pulmonary embolism, for example. Right, so stuff like that. And then for the equation, PaCO2 is your arterial CO2. PeCO2 is your expired air PCO2, which you can actually calculate with the spirometer, right? So when you're given these numbers, you can just plug them in and you get this. That's it. Right? And if they told you how much is physiologic dead space, and then you calculate something and it's, not working out to be the same about the physiologic dead space, then you have some kind of lung issue. That's where this plays a role, right? Physiologic dead space should be equivalent to anatomic dead space. But when you calculate this, right, and you calculate a number that doesn't match the anatomic dead space, that means that something's wrong and the patient has some kind of lung disorder. Ventilation, they have two. They have minute ventilation and alveolar ventilation. And this is really not that bad at all. It's kind of logical. It's not like a weird calculus equation or anything like that. Minute ventilation is the total volume of gas entering the lungs per minute, right? Totally makes sense from the naming. So how much air is actually entering the lung every minute. So you're going to have to maintain a normal respiratory rate, right? And you have your normal values given here, right? Respiratory rate should be between 12 to 20. If you're breathing slower or faster, something's wrong. Tidal volume should be about 500. Dead space should be about 150, right? So if you do that, then here they tell you minute ventilation is VE is equal to VT times respiratory rate, right? Respiratory rate. So this VE over here, right? This E over here is minute ventilation, VE. So tidal volume times respiratory rate is equal to 500 times 15, which is 7,500 milliliters per minute. That's the amount of air that enters our lung every minute as long as we're breathing normally and our lung is healthy. Alveolar ventilation should be less than that, right? Because not all the air that enters your lungs actually goes to alveoli. So alveolar ventilation is always less than your minute ventilation. That's a fact no matter what kind of lung you're working with. So here you can see there's a tiny change in the equation. Now you subtract dead space from the tidal volume. All right, so you subtract dead space, so you do 500 minus 150 now. And your dead space might be different because they might have actually made you calculate it using this equation first. Either way, you subtract it, then you multiply by 15 and you get a smaller number, 5,250, which is less than 7,500. Right, so alveolar ventilation is always less than minute ventilation. You should definitely keep that in mind so you don't fuck that up in a question, right? Because you can catch yourself making a mistake right there. So that's two pretty good concepts right here. And then this was a really big discussion about volumes, capacities, and pulmonary vascular resistance based off of those volumes. Make sure you revise that, watch this video again if you have to, but truly understand the complete change of everything that's happening from here to here. Right? How do you go from here to here as you breathe in? Why does alveolar vessel pressure increase as you're breathing in? Right? Why do extra alveolar blood pressure decrease as you're breathing in? Those are three answers. Those are three questions that you should be able to answer without hesitation. All right. And as usual, if you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email. And if you're interested in buying the PDF that I'm using in the video, You can send me an email for that too. Bunch of notes in it, all the questions you could work with, etc., etc. Thank you for watching, and Happy New Year to all of you guys. Keep studying, but for now, take some time off. If you're attending this live, just go relax, have some fun with family, kick back, and then we'll continue more tomorrow. Thank you very much for joining.